Hello Baker 4T students. We are now in week 5 and this week we have a little bit easier and then you just have the do good audit. And again, that's just a probably 3 to 4 page paper, and by now you should be really honing in on which country you're going to do for your final project. So when you do that do good audit, think about whether if it's in India, Australia, wherever it may be, that whatever product or service that you're going to do the direct foreign investment in, how are we going to think about all those things relative to the people, to the environment, and make sure that business is making good decisions. And this paper can be general in nature, but I've listed some topics there in the syllabus that you can focus on. You can look at a general of all those areas, or you can focus on just a couple of those areas, or one item in particular that stands out to you. But that will be due the following week, and after that we get a week off, which will be really nice, and then we kind of cruise towards the end there with looking at your final project, your book base of pyramid report. So that will be due in week 6, and then your final project presentation due in week 7. So use a little bit of the downtime if you want to try to get some of those projects cleaned up and ready to go, because they'll approach very quickly. Okay, for this week, in week 5, we look at chapter 14 and 15. We start off with chapter 14. Kind of tells us that there are business cycles, and we have to be realistic about markets, and it can vary, and we have markets that change all the time. We have to adapt. One thing that made me think about this weekend, when I went and got some gas, it was only $2.60, and that's actually a very good thing from the U.S. consumer's perspective, and can help stimulate our economy by having cheap energy. But if we look at the Russian economy right now, they were dependent on oil being a lot more expensive, and they're starting to hurt. Putin's at the G20 conference in Australia, and he's getting a lot of political pressure from around the world, and nobody wants to help him out economically because of his kind of intrusions in Ukraine. So the Russian economy could be in trouble here, and it's ultimately the Russian people that get hurt because of his decision. So, but they'll go through a cycle too. If they do allow their continued stance in Ukraine, the rest of the world is going to kind of shun them, and it's going to hurt their economic prowess in the overall global community. So, but anyways, with some of these things they mentioned in this chapter, we look specifically, like the idea of drive demand. They gave an example in the textbook about Boeing's, their airline jets. So if an economy starts shrinking, probably the orders, or I should say if travel stops, to a degree, the orders for jets are going to decrease too. So we have to be cognizant about that, especially a lot of, in this textbook we talk about mostly marketing and consumer, but we also might be marketing to businesses too. And I'd say probably half business out there is business to business. And we all have relationships in our own companies where we work with different vendors. We're trying to get the best bang for our buck, if you will. We like to be what we call technically efficient and economically efficient, and hopefully make good decisions with our other businesses that we do business with or buy from or are selling to, that it's in the best interest of both parties, and that it's a long-term relationship that exists between the two parties. And with that too, also service is important too. So after we sell the product, does the one buying our product feel comfortable that can follow up with us and ask all those questions that are important? And then if there's something breaks down, that you'll be there to get it fixed. So I've had various experiences with working in many different businesses, and some well and some not so well. So it just varies, and if you want to stay in business, you're going to have to do all the right things and make sure that they feel comfortable that you're going to be there for the long term too. They also mentioned some things about quality standards. They mentioned about the ISO 9000. The Japanese are very proud about getting those standards. Obviously, it's a third party, but having others recognize your quality can go a long way in helping you sell your product. And it's something, the Japanese, they're probably, quality is one of the most important things in the world to them. And, for many years there, if you think about Japanese electronic products, they were at the top of the market. And it's been more, probably the past decade that others, like some of the South Koreans with Samsungs and others, have been more and kind of taken away some of their market share. But for the Japanese, quality is still a very important thing to them. In fact, some of the recent embarrassments with Camry and the Toyotas and some of the Toyota products really kind of hurt some of the Japanese executives a little bit because they felt they got away from those quality standards. Okay. Another thing we might have to do in markets too, business to business, is go to trade shows. Remember my dad when younger, he would tell me about his travels to Paris, going to the Paris Air Show when he used to live in Wichita, Kansas. Because they'd have to have a presence. And sometimes you might even argue that trade shows probably have implicit values. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to sell any products, but it's just you have to have a presence there in the market. It's kind of almost, if you're not there, people are going to forget about you. And that can have economic costs too, if they no longer think you're relevant in the field. Okay. So a little bit more about that. They talk in that chapter about website design and phones and kind of how important it is to make sure your website is up to meet the business-to-business needs for today. All right, our last chapter, chapter 15, I thought that was kind of interesting. I started off with IKEA. I know we have a store somewhere close in Kansas I'll have to visit someday. I think they kind of tout, maybe furniture at a lower cost, maybe to a certain type of demographic. But, they're going to take it on Nebraska Furniture Mart to a degree, which is a dominant player in the market. But with this chapter, it talked about some of the things about middlemen. And this is very important, trying to get your product marketed overseas. And there's a lot of things involved that we may not necessarily always think about. You think about advertising, market research, warehousing, financing, storage. All these things that may have to take place to kind of get your product from the maybe supplier to the consumer. And they mentioned, like in Japan, it's not an easy task. In fact, there's a lot of middlemen involved, a lot of payments involved, and by the time it gets to the consumer, that price might be jacked up quite a bit, which is a concern because you're worried about whether people will buy your product. Because if they're not buying it at the product at the very end of that push, you're not going to be selling it very long on the front end side of it. So negotiating, working with middlemen is very important, and sometimes we have to work within that culture to get our product sold. It's going to be a little bit harder maybe for just us to jump into the market and sell it directly. We might have to work through some of those marketing channels. Okay, but with that, kind of wrap up that chapter. They also kind of mentioned about trying to identify a middleman, looking at the relationship, and what happens if you have to terminate a middleman, and hopefully you give them the right incentives so they work with you, because honestly, a lot of times you're going to depend on them to enter a market. You're going to be the foreigner, and they're going to be able to present it in a way that hopefully it's going to get the product sold or the service sold in that market. So, well, that's it for this week. Enjoyed reading all your forum posts this week, and again, we'll have one more week to do some forum posts related to something in chapters 14 and 15. But do email if you have any questions. But otherwise, have a great week, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.